Okay, y'all. Well, thanks for coming to my class. In the series, I'm going to be going through basically each chapter of my dissertation, and each class will be focused on one chapter, pretty much. So today we're going to be basically going through my introduction. I wanted to start with some discussion questions. We can start, start with the first one, I think. Just simply, what does it mean to you for a society or a country to be democratic?
Like, probably for everyone, I would say it looks a lot.
All right, yeah, that's it. Anyone else? Yeah.
It reflects like the ability to participate in government, the ability to influence things in society.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Yeah, I would say I think those are the prices. Like the ability for a population of a country or whatever kind of population
Like,
to have say over the policy and practice of that nation.
Yeah. What kind of policies would you say any are off the table? Incorrect. General topics, I guess, like social policy, economic policy, diplomatic
It's a foreign
policy.
It's a difficult thing because in an ideal world, there is. If there is a discriminated against group in a society with a minority, right? Like if they're discriminated against, then all people in that society having to say over that they might be that group to be discriminated against.
Right, yeah.
Like that doesn't. I get that's about education and stuff prior to enacting policy.
Yeah. Right. No, I get that. Protection for minority groups.
you're the biggest question.
What areas of society, I guess, and policy should be open to democratic debate?
That area should be discussed and debated.
Yeah, I would say everything. I mean, yeah, everything should be open to discuss. Yeah, I would agree.
I would say non-emergency things should be discussed and debated. But I think there is a certain power in somebody being like, "Hey, there's a hurricane. Let's go solve it, and we can talk about it if we get it wrong afterwards." So yeah, that's a good point. That's going to be something that'll come up throughout this class. The emergency or the exception. How do we decide when there's an emergency? Who gets to decide when there's an emergency? I think a really core thing is you have to ask the answer, no matter what discussion around that emergency. Like you should never be able to say it was an emergency. Everybody goes, okay, and like looks away. Yeah. Which I think we're going to talk about.
But I think definitely like discussing as much as you can in advance of the situation what democratically what policies will happen in times of emergency. Right? There will always be new emergencies but you have a standardized procedure.
Yeah, it's the same that happened in the certain industry. After all this nightmare policies got pulled up against terrorists and stuff. Such a shit show. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. How do you think the U.S. government? What does democracy mean in the U.S. government? Yes.
I was going to say, not very much.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Where's this? Where everyone's allowed in this on like this also way we are regularly. Oh well, yeah. The question is whether or not they, and this is such a weird one thing, right? But like whether or not the way the word is used may not reflect a genuine belief in its definition that way. It's a propaganda word, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they have a distinct definition that they don't have like that. They know that they're lying, I would say, probably most of the time, right? So like they know the real definition of the term, but it's but it's useful as a semiotic term with a lot of like little meaning in it that people will assume things about what it means that something about this too. What's that?
Like a talk.
Yeah. It can be
Used.
I teach this in my couple studies, not so much the semiotics of things, right? Like something has this immediate meaning, and then it has like all the inferences that we make based on our life experiences and like our assumptions and our theology after that. And so those assumptions can be drawn upon by using the word, regardless of whether or not the actions in taken reflects an emotion. If that makes sense.
Semiotics means like studies.
Right?
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Like the American flag means America, but then also to different people, it's going to mean different things. It's going to mean our oppressor. It's going to mean freedom and democracy, whatever. Yeah. Symbols have vast meaning beyond their like literal definitions.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think democracy doesn't really ever include its government like a shared rate. There's cultural use for it. But I think democracy is used more so as a tool to justify whatever ends America wants to achieve for the rest of the world. Yeah, so typically not like doing so.
Yeah.
This is just pretext or could be if you want to.
Yeah, that's it. So you both brought up that democracy is there's no hard fast definition that everyone agrees on what democracy is. That's it. Different things, different people, different cultures. That's important. Clear. Why do you think money and power inequality influences a democratic process, say an election or a democratic system?
I see this with people who have lots of money that can influence the outcomes or the policies that the government in the next year tries to achieve. So, we see that a lot in U.S. government. People with lots of money lobbying for things they want and stuff.
Yeah, I thought this by media possible tips ones. Somebody who already has a lot of wealth and influence is going to just naturally get better in an election than somebody who doesn't. If you don't have to worry about working and chop people up for time, you already know a bunch of really rich people that you can like go around and choose and act. Yeah. Eric?
It,
Yeah, definitely. And let's say in else.
I basically if I were if I want to talk to the best way I think that is yeah, I here that's up to me. Here that that's
Yeah, it's to be it's good. Yeah, I think sad. Yeah. And in this room, basically, I think we can all pretty much agree that it's a negative thing. It's a bad thing to have in questions. It's weird to have things like super PACs. They're billionaire donors that can give all the money they want to them. If either that money equals free speech, right? People also people who want money have more speech. Okay. That's good. I also want you to think throughout this about internationally as well. Like there are some democracies that are much poorer and smaller, weaker. There are some democracies that are much larger, wealthier, and sometimes those larger, more powerful, wealthier democracies attempt to influence the democracies of other smaller countries. They can't do the other. They can't do it the other way around. There'll be something that comes up throughout this. Okay, I'm going to tell you a story, and then I'm going to go into kind of like breaking down my dissertation a bit. But first, little mini case study I'm going to try to give to sort of exemplify some of the themes I'm going to speak on. Okay, so I'll start with this. In 2014, a little bit before Christmas, President Obama made a speech where he was announcing a new policy toward Cuba. He said, 50 plus years of trying to isolate and choke off the island hasn't worked, hasn't advanced U.S. policy, U.S. interests in there. Castro, the communist regime is still there. So to better advance U.S. interests, we're going to follow a policy of engagement with Cuba. This was a short time during the late Obama years where there was some opening up with Cuba, which brought some good things to Cuban island. In his speech, though, he talks about we will open up money flows into Cuba, allow more money to come into Cuba. We're going so like remittances, but also the U.S. government and U.S. corporations are going to put more money into Cuba, specifically supporting things like private businesses in Cuba. They're opening up. They're starting to allow more private business. Investing in civil society, which I can talk later about what exactly civil society is. But generally, you can think of it between like the space, conceptual space in between business and government. So like churches, labor unions, non-governmental organizations, nonprofits, things like that. Because they're like the family, these deep part of civil society. Okay. He says we're gonna increase the flow of information technology to Cuba as well. We're gonna start as part of that investing in civil society, we're going to start bringing in technology that can access the internet, say, you keep up with the civil society partners that we're building bridges with. And he says this will promote positive change in the island and be more effective at advancing U.S. interests here. And when he makes that speech, he also praises the release of this guy on the screen here called Alan Brooks, who had been imprisoned in Cuba since, I think, 2009. So it was in there, he was in Cuba for about 5 years. Brooks had been in Cuba doing a covert operation as a subcontractor for the U.S. Agency for International Development. He was an employee of a private corporation called Development Alternatives Incorporated, or Development Alternatives International. Now it's known as like DAI. And as part of his covert operation, he was smuggling like internet devices, communications equipment into Cuba, embedding with a Jewish humanitarian group. But I think the humanitarian group was real. There's a small Jewish population in Cuba. The group was real, but they were not really part of it. They were just pretending to be part of this group. And he was like smuggling all this shit into like carry-on bags, like suitcases and stuff, just like stuffed in full of like laptops and phones and anything else you need to like communicate over the internet. They were trying to set up a internet service that the Cuban government wouldn't be able to detect, so that they could have their own communications channels without the government coming across. Cuban government gets wise to this, and they arrest him because they banned USA programs from their country, and also you're just not allowed to like smuggle things in like that without the government knowing. Supposed to declare things like that. Okay, so what he was doing, he was kind of setting up the infrastructure that they needed to create what they called in internal government documents a Cuban Spring, which was inspired by first the Persian Spring that started, I think happened in 2008 in Iran, and then people probably know of the Arab Spring, or more famously happened like a year or two later after that. Okay, so he was setting up the infrastructure, and after he was arrested, they set up this thing called Zunzunio, which they referred to as a Cuban Twitter in the internal documents. It was essentially like a free messaging service, and that was important for offering to people because it is free. Like, it was like being able to text and talk over the internet for humans, which at the time was kind of expensive for most people. That Zunzunio Cuban Twitter thing was created by another private corporation working on behalf of U.S. Agency for International Development called Creative Associates International, which is a total people don't know what CIA names are like for front groups. That's total CIA. You should call it CAI. They literally just change those letters around a bit. So they're creating this Cuban Twitter. And at the same time they were doing that, which by the way, to fund it, they had it based in Spain, like the actual company, like the Zunzunio company based in Spain. To pay for it, they siphoned off development money that was supposed to go to a project in Pakistan, and they funneled it through a bank in Liechtenstein. So it was kind of like a global scheme of multiple countries involved. They had to funnel things through private companies and networks of just money and institutions to try to cover this up and keep it secret. The plan was to start with stuff that would appeal to young people, especially like music, cultural events, sports, entertainment stuff. It would be like just non-political stuff that would excite young people, get young people interested, and start using the platform. And the plan was to start with that, and once they had reached a critical mass of numbers of people who were using the service, then they would start having political messages put throughout the platform. They would have a story of like, oh, someone got arrested. Like, let's get people riled up about someone getting arrested for bullshit reasons, or stories about the government being corrupt, or stories about the government being incompetent, let's say. As part of their plan to try to get young people on board, get people excited about it, they tried to influence and appropriate the Cuban hip-hop community. Most prominently with Los Aldeanos, the villagers. So they would offer, you can imagine in maybe a poorer country, aspiring musicians, especially from poorer backgrounds, they wanna make this into a career. So you can offer them as creative associates, you can offer them equipment, networking opportunities, travel opportunities. Things that would be really attractive to a young up-and-coming artist trying to make a career. The guy they had running this attempt to co-opt the Cuban hip-hop community, was a Serbian man who had been involved in U.S. democracy promotion efforts in Eastern Europe, in multiple countries for that. So again, multiple countries being involved in this. Their scheme did not work. The Cuban government, despite their best efforts to cover it up, they literally had to suppress the number of users that were on this thing so that they could keep the signals to a manageable level and keep it quiet. And they were desperately trying to find corporate entities to take on this company so that it could be completely privately run rather than funded by the government. So at this point, even though it's created by a private company, it's funded by the government, the U.S. government. So they're not able to get corporate sponsors to take this thing over, and the Cubans start getting wise to it. And before they're able to hit their critical mass number of people, they decide to end the thing. They just shut the whole thing down. So the users literally didn't even understand why the service shut down. So that was a failed attempt at creating a kind of protest movement, that would seem grassroots, it would seem democratic, and it would seem like young people rising up against their big bad government to bring democracy to the island. I give the story to try to illustrate a few things. One is the transnational aspect of this democracy promotion thing, what they call democracy promotion in U.S. policy. So it's transnational. It involves many different countries, people learning from projects from other countries, borrowing personnel who were involved in other projects from other countries like Serbia, siphoning money off from other countries, projects in other countries, using banks from the Cayman Islands or Liechtenstein or any of those tax havens. Two is the public-private partnership nature of democracy promotion. It's a lot of U.S. government funding, but it's the work is provided by private corporations. A lot of the documentation is held by private corporations who are not under FOIA responsibility, which is important. They get to cover up they get to keep their documents more easily than the government gets to keep them. Third aspect is this stuff is sold as benevolent, democratic, grassroots, humanitarian, lots of good things. It's sold as a very like positive, like we're just trying to live out our democratic ideals and promote democracy and human rights around the world, right? It's sold that way. Fourth bit is the importance of media and information technology. So like all that shit that was being smuggled in to try to create this like independent infrastructure. Media and Obama's speech, he mentions it as well. The importance of like we're gonna bring more information technology here. We're gonna make connections with the Cuban people that way. So media very important. Fifth element is the importance of covert operations. So they're doing all this stuff secretly, and trying to make sure no one, even in America or Cuba, really knows about it. So it's just like we got the U.S. government, maybe some people at USAID, and then the people directly involved in it, in these private corporations like CAI. Kind of connected to that is the illegality of a lot of this stuff. Just breaking Cuban law, other countries' laws, international law, and even U.S. law in the process of this. So obviously they're breaking Cuban law. They also broke Spanish laws because under Spanish law you're not supposed to like gather political data on people. That was another thing. They were gathering political data on the users of it. So you're not supposed to do that under Spanish law. And you're also not supposed to like send like unwarranted solicitations from like a Spanish platform. So breaking some Spanish laws. They're also breaking some U.S. laws in the process of this too. USAID is overseen by the Department of State, which is not supposed to engage in covert operations. USAID is not supposed to do covert operations. In fact, they say that like when they start getting covered in the news, they say like we're a humanitarian development organization, not an intelligence organization. And they would use euphemisms like discreet to avoid using terms like covert to make it to try to finagle the law. Weasel around law. But they're not supposed to do that kind of covert action stuff. Final bit I just want to highlight is the broader context of like the U.S.-Cuban relation, which is the U.S. had been doing a lot of violence in Cuba up to that point. And they continue to do so. People might know about all the terrorism that the U.S. committed after the Cuban Revolution, trying to sabotage their economy, trying to assassinate their leaders. Before that, they had this very harsh neo-colonial relationship where they were literally allowed to just intervene anytime they wanted in the country. And the blockade is probably the biggest one. It's cost Cuba something like $130 billion over the course of like 60 years of that blockade being in effect. A lot of money for a small island nation. So for me, my dissertation is focused on the violence that the U.S. commits abroad. And more specifically, it focuses on how that violence is covered up, is like masked and portrayed to be the opposite of violence, portrayed to be promoting democracy, portrayed to be stopping violence. It's about the art of turning imperialist, callous, like zero-sum self-interest, just like I'm going to just pursue my own like interests at the expense of your interests, turning that into its opposite through the powers of money and institutions and credentials and like aesthetics, like media narratives, dressing things up to look Like they're different than what they actually are. I'm going to go through basic points real quick so people can, and stop me if there's any questions, by the way. Feel free to stop me at any point. So just give you my methodology real quick, which is history, which the most basic, simple definition that a lot of historians actually go with is history is basically just the study of change over time. The change of X over time. Which I think is simple enough for what we need. I focus on political economy as well, combine the two, which is just kind of looks at the relations between economics and political aspects of a thing. So like how do economic systems and political systems interact with each other, or economic conditions like say wealth inequality influence the political system, or how does the political system influence wealth inequality, or how people make money, who makes what money in which ways. Okay. If you're in history at all, you might know the difference between like primary sources and secondary sources. Primary sources are basically like the things that were created during the time period in question. Like, so if you wanted to learn about the Titanic sinking, primary sources could be newspapers that came out around the same time that that the Titanic sunk, like reporting on this thing. It's more complicated than that, but I'll just leave that. I'll leave it there for now. But my primary sources are like internal government documents, important policy papers, documents from NGOs and corporations. Most of the stuff you can easily find online just with an internet connection, and also Freedom of Information Act requests, which if anyone wants to know about that, I can explain it, but it's a complicated and very long, arduous process. Secondary sources are more like usually stuff that was written after the fact, like a book that's about coverage of the Titanic sinking that came out maybe in the 1950s, 1960s, or 2024. So and it might use primary sources, but like if you were citing it to write a book about the Titanic sinking, that would be a secondary source for you. Secondary sources can sometimes become primary sources depending on what your topic is. If you were writing a historiography about how historians have written about the Titanic sinking, or how historians have written about coverage of the Titanic sinking, then you would use secondary sources as your primary sources. You'd be like, oh, they wrote about it this way in the 1950s, but then they changed to writing about it this way in the 1970s. And then, like, once you get to the 2000s, you start to see this being discussed. Okay. So, but my secondary sources are theory on Marxism, democracy promotion, media imperialism, and deep politics, which I'll go into what those are. Okay. So if you want to get just like a broad sense, or a broad like vibe of what my dissertation is about, I think you could do a lot worse than watching the Panama Deception, which you can find online for free. It came out in 1991, I believe. It actually won an Oscar that year. But it was a really great documentary about the US invasion of Panama in 1989. It's got some great characters in it who actually come up in great interviews by scholars who actually come up in my research. But democracy promotion in US government policy terms is a multi-billion-dollar industry that encompasses dozens of agencies and nonprofits, corporations. there are lots of offices and agencies, things all across the US government that has democracy promotion, at least as like a core value, if not the primary purpose of like what they're doing. So like USAID has a office or a bureau that's dedicated to like democracy, human rights, labor. But these days, especially, kind of anything, a lot of things that the government, US government does has a democracy promotion component to it. Like that's part of their like goals when they set out to do something in the world. And this is also kind of true of Europe as well. So like Western Europe, there's a lot of Western European countries that get involved in this. Important point I want to stress is that like this system of what they call democracy promotion was not created by popular masses. There was no like popular fervor or like social movements demanding that the US throw out democracy abroad. That's not how this stuff developed. This was a result of government, business, and also some labor insiders and people from both parties getting together and hashing out this thing that we call democracy promotion now. I guess I'll say it started officially like as an institutionalized thing, but like formally we are promoting democracy through these institutions that are dedicated to divine democracy. Started under Ronald Reagan. So just keep that in mind. And their definition of democracy that they go with is a very minimalist definition of democracy. It essentially means that people can vote for 2 or more political parties to elect their representatives in government, and also that media isn't state-owned. It's like that media, basically anyone can create their own like media outlet, newspaper or TV station, things like that. Which of course needs money. Needs having money for the most part. So in this situation, economic democracy is not part of the equation here. The idea that people should be able to vote on economic policy to, say, nationalize a railroad or provide social security for people, that's not considered to be part of this definition of democracy. So that's a really important part that'll come up throughout this. Other thing is media imperialism, which very just simply means you look at the relations between media, which can mean communication technologies. It can also mean like CNN, like the mainstream media, or the establishment media. But it can also just mean like technologies for like creating information and communications. Connections between those things and empire. So like one of the first books that kind of explored these things went all the way back to like ancient Egypt. They were like, how does the technology that they were using of like clay tablets and then papyrus scrolls, how does that change how the government works? Like how does the way that the government communicates with itself, people communicate, who gets to communicate, who can read, who can write? How does that impact power? So a lot of it's looking at like concerned with military and economic power, like how is media useful in war? How is media useful in dominating a foreign government or a foreign people? How is media useful in reproducing dominant ideologies? So how do you make the ideas of the ruling class to also be the ideas of all the people who don't have power or money? How do you get them to think the way you want them to think? But the other side, which I unfortunately won't be looking at, but is important, I want to mention, it can also be about like resisting imperialism as well. Like how can it be used to resist domination, resist economic coercion, resist imperialism. People I know, some of us might have read at least some of Bernard Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent Report, but that is still written in the 1980s. About the political economy of like mainstream media and like how it through no conspiracy, just through how it's structured, how this media reproduce ruling class ideologies and especially facilitate U.S. foreign intervention. That's what Manufacturing Consent was about, and it's still a like really important book for my research. You research this stuff. Okay. Deep politics people might be less familiar with, and that one might be a little more, I don't know, controversial or like, yeah, absolutely. So I'll start with parapolitics, which is kind of a smaller thing underneath the umbrella of deep politics. Parapolitics is like systems and practices where you consciously, purposefully try to keep things secret, keep things under wraps, avoid public accountability, avoid public knowledge about what's going on. Classic example is like covert operations that like the CIA engages in. That's like parapolitics. This stuff was initially developed by a Canadian academic. He's an English academic and poet called Peter Dale Scott. And the way he kind of came to it was he was also a diplomat in the 1950s and early 60s. And he was especially involved in diplomacy efforts in Laos, which was going through a civil war that was heavily influenced by the CIA. They call it the secret war because the CIA was illegally, covertly trying to influence things in Laos, and they essentially stoked and just incited civil war in the country for over a decade. And he so he was involved in diplomatic efforts, and he's like, well, what the fuck is going on? Why things are going on that can't really be explained through the normal channels of like politics or how things are supposed to work on paper. So he starts writing about that because he's really interested in like how this is happening. Later on, he kind of expands it to what he calls deep politics, which is all those political practices and arrangements, deliberate or not. So they can be unconscious, they can be unintended, they can be not on purpose, which are usually repressed rather than acknowledged. So Scott is a really old man now. He's still alive though. He's about the same age as Don Chomsky, I think. He's like 95. But he's still around. A good example of like deep politics is I think the Council on Foreign Relations, which I have their little logo there, which people may have heard of. It's essentially like a fancy New York club for like rich guys and politicians and like the elites of society, like getting together, negotiating things. It was supposed to like help build bridges between Republicans and Democrats and like liberals and conservatives so that they can come to consensus on like how America should govern. Started in the 1920s, I believe, shortly after World War I, and it was very like Anglophile. It was very like, we need to be like Britain, we need to be involved in the world, we need to be more active, which means basically we need to be more imperialist. we need to do what Britain's doing. So eventually, Scott does get to the term like the deep state, which I'm not going to get into that really with my project, but it is a relevant term or a relevant idea. I chose not to get into it too much because it has a lot of connotations to it that most academics aren't very comfortable with, and I'm trying to not alienate too many academics with my work. So I'm kind of leaving that aside, and also it's a really complicated idea of like, where is the deep state or who makes up the deep state? But like the definition he comes up with is basically like an unelected, uncountable part of society that we're a milieu, like a network, not necessarily like individual structures or specific people, but like a milieu, a social milieu that has the power to steer society and sometimes redirect it in important ways. So that's all to say that politics is not democratic. Like it's in fact very like anti-democratic in many ways. And part of my contribution to this is like connecting that with democracy promotion. Because democracy promotion is supposed to be democratic, right? It's literally in the name. It's supposed to be done democratically, and it's supposed to encourage more democracy. At least that's what many people would assume, right? All right. Okay, just gonna go real quick, explain what these two institutions are: USAID and the NED, my two major institutions. USAID, kind of simple. It's a federal agency. It's supposed to be tasked with like development assistance, foreign aid. You know, when a country is going through natural disaster or something, they bring in food aid. That's a classic example. They have administrators, and several of those, the most important people in it, are nominated by the president and then confirmed by the Senate. Kind of normal government agency stuff. Yet at the same time, throughout its history, it's been involved in covert operations, basically from the very beginning. One of the best examples of that is Office of Public Safety. This was a thing that started the year after USAID was established. And it was Office of USAID. And it was tasked with supporting and creating police forces around the world. So they would literally create other countries' police forces for them, or help train them, help equip them, things like that. In the 1970s, as a lot of things were coming out about what the CIA folks were doing, it came out that this was basically a front for the CIA. The guy directing this thing was a CIA officer, and they were training people to how to torture. They were training cops how to build bombs, not how to defuse bombs or like stop bombings, but how to create bombs and secretly plant bombs. Kind of general like counterinsurgency and insurgency stuff. They were also helping to support like some drug trafficking stuff that the CIA was involved in Laos at the time as well. So that's USAID. The NED is a little bit more complicated. So USAID starts in '61 under JFK. The NED starts in 1983 under Ronald Reagan, and it was an explicit initiative of Ronald Reagan. It's technically a non-governmental organization. It's technically not part of the government. It's anyway just like a non-profit NGO, independent, they say. Yeah, it was created by an act of Congress, gets nearly all of its funding from Congress, and it has to report its activities to Congress. Its initial board of directors was handpicked by the Reagan administration and Business Insiders, and also some people from the AFL-CIO. And those boards of directors, they elect their successors, basically. Like, it's 3-year terms, and they just they handpick the first terms of people, and those people got to elect everyone else who comes in later. A lot of these people are there for a very long time. Like, the first president of the NED is there from 1983 until 2021. So almost 40 years. Some of these people are involved for decades. Yeah, I'll get into this a bit more later. How many of y'all have heard of the military-industrial complex? Okay. So you might generally have an idea of like what that is. You know, the relations between like the military establishment and like all these arms manufacturers that make tons of money off of war. And they love war because it makes them a lot of money. So they love to promote war and sell weapons and shit around. There's a former CIA analyst who became like a big whistleblower and like kind of a scrappy like muckraker after he left the agency, where he was Ray McGovern. Got tackled and arrested as like a 70-something-year-old man because he was like trying to free Julian Assange. He's really into stuff like that. And he came up with kind of he just said like, gave an expanded idea of the military-industrial complex, which he says should basically be expanded to include not just military and industry, but also Congress, which was when Eisenhower initially popularized the military-industrial complex. The congressional side of that was also supposed to be in there by the original speechwriter, but they didn't want to be too controversial about it and like piss off people in government they had worked with, so they kept that out. Supposed to be there originally. But military-industrial congressional, but also intelligence, media, academia, and think tanks. Like, these are all kind of part of the same milieu, the same people who are part of, whenever there are big decisions, they are part of the people who get to decide or influence those decisions. They're the people who are either in the room making the decisions themselves, or they're the people who are providing the research or providing like information and data that the people making the decisions use to make the decisions. A lot of people call this like a revolving door. You might have heard that term of like revolving door politics. You know, as soon as someone leaves Congress, you know, they're done as a senator, they just go straight into being a CEO of an oil company or an arms manufacturer or a think tank or a consultancy, something like that. Like they made all these good deals and relationships in government with businesses, and so they just go straight into business once they leave. That stuff can work with all of those institutions, and the NED fits that description very well. If you look at their, here, I'll show you the NED website. If you look at their board of directors, stuff fits very well. Like, okay. Dan Wilson, he's the new president since 2021. So their second president. He was involved in the government. He was a diplomat. He was a big NATO guy. He was involved in a lot of NATO. He was involved in NATO itself, and he was also an important part. He was a leader of the Atlantic Council, which is basically NATO's think tank. It's funded by all these NATO countries. It's focused especially on like issues affecting NATO. Kenneth Woolak, was a leader of the National Democratic Institute, which I'll talk about that in a couple weeks. And he was also a lobbyist for AIPAC in the 1980s, so pro-Zionist Israeli lobbyist. This guy, I believe, was a Democratic congressman. This guy was a Republican politician. Chief Executive Officer of the Business Council, Marlene Colucci, also the treasurer of the NED, so like a pro-business think tank or business association. Ann Applebaum is a journalist, part of the media. I believe she writes for The Atlantic and The Washington Post, so like the big mainstream publications, and is also an academic. Very terrible right-wing neoliberal historian, very awful. Terrible histories of Eastern Europe and Soviet and Soviet. A lot of these people are diplomats. This guy, Scott Carpenter, was from Google. Some of these people are from arms manufacturers or military contractors, which Google is a military contractor. Tim Kaine, former senators or current senators. I think this guy is another academic guy. Several of these people are diplomats. Foundation for Defense of Democracy, that's another think tank. So it's basically like that concept. Mickey Bat is called it. Basically describes the NED pretty well, or the leadership of the NED. People make this decisions. So that's an introduction to the NED. Last bit is I'll just explain the breakdown for the future classes. So next week I'll talk about like the theory stuff, try to get more in depth into the ideas behind the dissertation. About Marxism as kind of the broad umbrella of like what my perspective is, and then go more in depth into what democracy promotion and imperialist politics is, especially democracy promotion. I need to explain that a little bit about like how people have talked about this thing called democracy promotion. We're not going to meet the week after that because it's spring break, and we're not going to meet the week after that either because this room is going to already be booked. But we'll come back on the 18th of March, and I'll start getting into the history of these things. I'll start with the Cold War, go through the CIA's cultural Cold War fronts and how those got exposed in the 1960s and caused a lot of problems for the CIA and a lot of problems for the American establishment, and how that transitioned into what we call democracy promotion today, and some of the first democracy promotion success stories that they had, which is the Iran-Contra, in Nicaragua, Iran-Contra up there, and Operation Cyclone, where Afghanistan. Class after that, I'll go more in depth into my case studies, how they reflect this history and show evolution of throughout time. Yugoslavia, Venezuela, Haiti, and Ukraine. And I hope that people will be interested in the Ukraine part because it is relevant for the war, the invasion that happened in 2022. And last one, I'll give you a really in-depth case study. Try to really illustrate these things in the series class. Any questions? Anyone want to discuss any of these things? Questions?
I could initially start writing a dissertation.
When did I start writing it? Well, I started writing on Syria in 2021, which really helped start my dissertation. That's what the initial inspiration for the dissertation. So you could kind of say I started writing it in 2021. But in terms of actually having the dissertation project as like a concrete thing, that wouldn't have been until fall of 2022. And that was when that's when I wrote my prospectus or like my proposal. You kind of try to map out or outline the entire project before you actually start writing the dissertation, so that it gets approved by a committee and you have to form a committee and all that stuff. So the actual writing of the dissertation itself, like if you like read my dissertation right now, the actual writing of that thing didn't begin until like very beginning of 2023. So it took me a little over a year to write the thing. But like I could not have written it in a year if I didn't do all this like other stuff to set it up. Yeah, anyone else? Did y'all ever hear that term deep politics before then? Or
I'm pretty sure you
yeah, I mentioned.
we talked about all this.
Yeah, you've heard about it, Blake?
Yeah, and the reason I know of it's because I looked into the deep state conspiracy theory stuff.
Yeah.
That's where I actually knew people that believed like on one side. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is like somewhat not specific QAnon, but like some conspiracy theories have like a little validity, but then others are like that shit off the walls.
Yeah.
So I just like looked into it. Like,
Okay. I guess did everyone hear that term deep state before today? Yeah. Where did you hear that from? Or what do you associate that with? Yeah.
it's not crazy, right? Shit. Would help each other. Yeah. I got bugs, and stuff like that.
Yeah, it was popularized by Alex Jones and Donald Trump. Like those are the two big people that grabbed onto it. Scott, like, and people who he was writing with came up with which are many years for popularized by like Alex Jones and those types. But it's an attempt to understand like why when you try to learn about history and the government, and especially like its history of like foreign interventions, the violence that it commits, you have to like come to the conclusion that like the way we're taught about how government works and how society works in like civics courses, like Civics 101, because the three branches of government and they all balance each other out, they all follow the Constitution and logic. That just not really doesn't seem to be how things work. And especially when you have like organizations like CIA or like other intelligence agencies and or like the US military doing things without telling anyone about it and trying to keep it a secret. And it's very hard to access that information. It's an attempt to understand like how does power actually work? How are decisions actually being made? And how can you
how can you try to study this stuff when the information that you need to understand it is the hidden way or the obscure in so many different ways? So how do you get access to the information, and how do you deal with that contradiction between what you're taught about how the government works and how the government actually seems to be working? Yeah. When people think about conspiracies, are conspiracies real? Are there any real conspiracies? Or are conspiracy theories valid in any way? Yeah.
There's a big difference between the conspiracy theories that are like all bases are actually giant tree stuff, giant cut it down, versus conspiracy theories that are like the CIA of drugs in San Francisco's water, which they did in the 80s. The 70s they did that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a weird. I think a lot of conspiracy theories do end up breaking back down to anti-Semitism, even though it's wild, because it's always like some nebulous they that's.
Yeah, and it's they who are in control.
And it's always. But yeah, there is also like shit the CIA admitted to, and you're on the left and you say, hey, the CIA did this.
You're making that up. You couldn't.
Anytime I try to bring up it's assassination. My mom's like, that's not true, and I'm like, literally, it is true.
Like, it's literally true. Where's that Djibouti?
Yeah, just because she killed him doesn't mean we can't erase it.
Or like, conspiracies, or like, there's actually this nebulous thing, and this is what's happening behind the scenes, and then like the conspiracies, it's like, there's a document.
Literally not a conspiracy.
It's not
we have a fucking. They will admit anything that people thought some fucking conspiracy theories about happening today. There will be paperwork coming out about in 10 years. Like that's just how it is.
Literally happened, and there's Robert Garcia and
so many people are like, oh, this one's like harmless, and I'm like, nope. Who's the person they're saying is doing the thing?
I only see how many levels of stress strategy from that. Oh, I hate surveys, very interesting.
And
Even the pyramids move.
Some cryptic stuff isn't anti-Semitism, it is conspiracy, I guess.
Yeah.
And depends on where they're going with it. Yeah. Believing they're real, I guess, is sort of a conspiracy, but also not. Like I would love it to look as much conspiracy, right?
Depends on how long it takes to get Nazis.
Exactly.
Also, for anybody who's not seen it. Yep. Like, yes.
It's so fun.
Paper sheet out there. It's
You lost his check mark for your
You did lose the check mark, but
it's really funny though. So yes. You get it from the bank.
You said that? Yeah. Didn't you see like that tweet as Joe Biden?
He did several. He did a lot of very sweet when he had his they're all super fun. Oh, that might have been. Yeah.
Yeah, so I like conspiracy theories also loaded and contested that they need certain things. Different people and different people try to claim to be that term. But a conspiracy is basically just two or more people. The definition is two or more people getting together, usually secretly, to conspire to commit a crime. So how many people planning out a crime, basically, and trying to carry out the crime, usually. Which is pretty simple. You can imagine like a lot of things involved with the current conspiracy definition. And there are conspiracies that that involve powerful people, right? I mean, the thing I like to highlight is with the Bush administration after 9/11 and the war on terror and the Iraq War. The Bush administration spun out a conspiracy theory that was Saddam Hussein was conspiring, and the insiders of the Iraqi government were conspiring to create weapons of mass destruction, and they were probably also conspiring with Al Qaeda to, if they didn't conspire to help 9/11, they're conspiring to help plan and do more terrorist activities. And that was part of the big justification for what happened to Iraq. And that's a conspiracy theory. And it's a fake one, now. Saddam Hussein was not conspiring to create weapons of mass destruction. They got rid of their weapons of mass destruction, which the US said he wasn't their ally, said most of stolen. And they did not have connections with Al Qaeda. Like Saddam and the top government in Iraq did not have the relationships with Al Qaeda. They didn't like those kinds of religious fundamentalists, extremists, groups, protecting prayer against them. But we don't call it a conspiracy theory because it's powerful people making up a conspiracy theory. So what gets labeled a conspiracy theory is also is an expression of power, who has prestige and legitimacy in public discourse. So we don't call it a conspiracy theory when powerful people are giving conspiracy theory. But when your own goal is to be conspiracy theory, that's what we call it. So yeah, conspiracies do happen, and conspiracy theories can be total bullshit, or they can, or the theory can be proven pretty not completely correct. So it's a complicated thing. So you can't. Yeah, any attempts to explain all of history as a conspiracy theory, usually falls into it's wild, connecting dots and what do they call it? Self-interested rationality, self-motivated reasoning, something like that. Part of my dissertation is trying to understand, and this is what this is something that is not unique to me. People who tried to grapple with this stuff before. It's you can think of history as all drift and structure and human element where individuals and individual choices and individual actions don't really matter very much. Just Marxists get accused of being that way. They are you don't account human agency. You just think that everything is structure and predetermined based on the economic structures of society and the economic technology of society. Marxists get accused of that a lot. You can also look at history as conspiracy. History is a result of some group of people or some individual always making a choice or failing to make a choice to steer history in a certain direction. It's more boring general example. You think of great man history. That's kind of related to that. These great men who through their charisma and competency, that make better than everybody else. Yeah, they're the ones that drive history forward and shape youth. So you can those are kind of the two extremes. And my part of my dissertation is trying to figure out where do those two things meet, or how do they interact with each other? Because it's not all just there are humans and things do have agency, and there are also structures that constrain human agency, give some people more agency than others. And how do those two things interact with each other? How does structure and agency
kind of like the use a Marxist term for it. So yeah, that's my first class. Sorry for going over time, but basically we're going to stick around for the meeting at 7:15. So yeah, any other questions or anything? Excited. Okay, good. I don't have anything interesting to say ever again. Any suggestions for like how I could, what do you want to hear more of, or what I could do to make things more engaging? That's something I always struggle with. It's like trying to. I like the discussion part. Yeah, if you do that. Colleagues mentioned like very specific, like starting out with a very specific case study. So I was like, okay, here's all the topics we're going to talk about. Here's your example, just all of it. Yeah, I think you can always refer back to if you're writing more about things. Well, okay, I think that's okay, awesome. I'm glad you picked that. My dissertation chair also liked that. And I started my dissertation with that story. It's like a preface. She also liked that. If people want to hear more about my about the process or anything like that, because I know some people are interested in grad school, I'd be happy to talk more about that.